Hi, everyone. This is Marissa Eck,
This is Jimmy O'Brien.
and this is your sixth Behavior Beacon newsletter. And we wanted to start today with a little quote that we hope you are all familiar with. I get by with a little help from my friends by the Beatles. And the reason we use that as our quote is today we're going to talk about all the different ways that we help our learners and how we can hopefully remove some of that help to increase some independence. But let's talk about prompts and wait time. So in this newsletter, we're going to break down what prompts are, the different variations of prompts, and how to use them, and most importantly, how to fade them out. Although we're going to emphasize that prompts are really helpful and how to use them, we do want to remind you that they are temporary. Prompts are not meant to be used forever. So the ultimate goal of implementing a prompt procedure, like what we're going to talk about in a bit, is to remove it. So we oftentimes hear the word prompt dependent or prompt dependency being thrown around when referring to learners who present as needing some extra help or some extra reminders to complete tasks or activities. From our perspective, prompt dependency is a blanket statement or label for a learner that does not naturally engage in a chain of behaviors or target behavior without a prompt or help to do so. We hear this all the time. And when we hear it, we roll our eyes because we hate to break it to you. Learners do not just become prompt dependent out of the blue. Learners only become prompt dependent when prompts are being consistently provided in their environment and therefore taking away opportunities for them to engage in that task or activity independently. And like we've talked about in some previous newsletters, what's the payoff to our learners' behaviors? Prompt dependency has a huge payoff in that someone or something is going to show up and save the day and prompt them through something, potentially. So we're going to be talking about how important it is to use prompts and how to fade them out.
Is this the point where now you need to prompt me? So you see what Marissa is doing is she wants to prompt me. She has to provide a little help. Very good prompt. See what I did there? What I did there?
Great. Okay, so again, remember guys, in previous letters, we have explained that the most effective way to change a learner's behavior is to change our own. So we're going to highlight some examples of when we've been told that a child is prompt dependent, or we've gone to observe a student who's been labeled as prompt dependent. And so here are some examples that you might find yourself in, or get you kind of sparked to think of your own kiddo. So one example is you might find yourself constantly reminding your learner the steps in how to wash their hands. Sometimes it's passive. You don't even realize that you're doing. You might be saying, oh, it's time to turn on the water. Don't forget to get your soap. Scrub both hands on both sides. Now dry your hands. But then if you're not there or someone's not there to give those vocal prompts, the learner may just stand in front of the sink, waiting for some of those cues that you might not even have been realizing that you were giving them every time. Another example is if in the morning before going out of the door to go to work or school, when that was a thing, you had to take a really important phone call or needed to run to the bathroom or forgot something in your purse. So you told your learner, go get ready for the bus. And you come back a few minutes later and find that they haven't completed any of those steps. Does that sound familiar? I imagine there might be some parents right now nodding their head. There might be some saying no, some other examples though, and that's the point. And that's okay. In an effort to encourage you guys to become more aware of these habits, please know that our goal is to decrease that prompt dependency that we hear about and promote independence during all parts of a learner's daily life.
Cool. So let's talk about, so what is a prompt? You hear it a lot. So prompts are just added help. They're just cues. They're these extra things that we do before a behavior occurs in order to get it to occur under the conditions we want it to occur. And we all, in our own lives, we set up our own prompts in order to help us engage in a future behavior. For example, I have my phone here, and when I go to sleep at night, I set a particular time for me to get up. Why? Because under the right conditions, I probably will not get up at the time that I'm supposed to get up. I forget things a lot. So what I might do is over here where I leave for my my house, I might put the most essential things there in order for me to remember not to forget it. In other words, I might put my keys there, I might put my wallet there, and sometimes, if you notice over there on the door, my wife will put textual prompts of things to remind Jimmy of what to do. If I'm going out to the store, well, here's what you need to do. So again, prompts are these ubiquitous things. They're everywhere. We're just going to start to talk, we're going to identify for you what are those kinds of things that your learner needs to help them do it. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing is how to get rid of those so that the behaviors will actually occur under the conditions under which we want them to occur. Okay, so what we're going to then talk about also are the types and methods of prompts and prompting. We'll review with you the different types and then 4 particular methodologies that will help you be cognizant of thinking about what does my learner need at this given moment and how can I kind of slowly and more effectively remove them till ultimately what's the goal here for my learner to do those things that they're supposed to do in those contexts. In other words, if they're washing their hands, what should be the actual natural prompts is going to the sink being there, turning on the water, the soap, and not things like where I have to point to the faucet or I have to say, hey, what do you need to do? Those kind of things. You always want to think about what should the learner be doing in particular situations or contexts or when asked to do answer questions and things. Okay, so let me review with you the types of prompts. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are your more obvious, common, everyday ones. You can have what's called a tactile or physical prompt, which basically means you are moving the learner to engage in the behavior. You will sometimes hear hand over hand. For example, if I was trying to teach you to clap your hands and you didn't have that, I might say, so ultimately we'd want to think about, if I said clap your hands, the learner should clap their hands, and then the consequence is, great job, way to go. But if your learner can't do that, I might provide tactile or physical prompts, which would look something like this. I would say, clap your hands, and now I will actually grab the learner's hands, guide them, and use the least amount necessary to get them going. That is known as a physical prompt. What later on we'll talk about are methods to fade out that physical nature. We could talk about things where we're fading out how much help, or we'll talk about how to fade by time, which we'll get into. You could also provide verbal prompts, which is basically giving the name of it. If I was teaching Marissa, what is the capital of New York, I could easily tell her, say Albany, which would evoke
Albany.
Thank you, very good. We could model the behavior. If it was something that we'd want the learner to say, I have an array on the table, and I'm asking the learner to maybe identify particular objects or pictures, I might say, hey, can you find the cup, right? I could use a physical prompt by guiding their hand, or I could model the behavior, say, hey, find the cup, and then I demonstrate it. So when I demonstrate it, that will help make Marissa to grab the cup. We can use what are called movement cues or positional cues. That's things like I might move the item a little bit closer if we're doing kind of a selection thing. I might kind of tap or make the cue or the answer a little bit more salient. All these types of things that helps the learner tune into what the correct answer is. There are also what are known as stimulus, adaptive, or enhancement prompts, and that's any things you can do to change materials needed for the learner to kind of look at it. I'm trying to think of like a really good common example. Marissa, do you have any right now?
I've seen this be done, especially for some of the kiddos that we see at MSA with shoe tying, like shoelace tying. So an example is putting like really bright highlighter tape on the ends of the shoelaces. And that's the cue, that's where they pick that up and then they start, the process. And so when you're using stimulus fading or an adaptive prompt, the goal is the first time you're going to use the really, really bright highlighter cue, and then let's say 3 or 4 days later, you're still teaching it, you're going to fade how bright that highlighter is using a different color tape. And then eventually you're going to remove the highlighting color so that it's just a natural shoelace, whatever color it is. And hope the goal is that they're able to pick it up and still engage in the same target behavior of tying their shoe in the absence of the bright cue.
Yeah, that's a good one. You know, another one, when I was in Catholic school, we had penmanship. So we actually had to learn how to do cursive writing. And in a lot of the penmanship books, it was all, you know, enhancement prompts. We would have the full letter and we were actually, you know, tracing the actual word. As you went through the pages, you know, what you would see is it wouldn't be the full word, but it would be like dotted lines. Then from dotted lines, it might be faded and faded and faded. What are they fading is the actual kind of the physical properties of it, so that eventually I'm able to write it on my own. So I'm sure that they're a lot more pervasive than the examples we're giving you.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk through some of the prompting methods. There are very different levels of prompting that we would recommend depending on the learner and depending on the skill. So the first one we're going to talk about is most to least. And this is what we would qualify as maximum help to minimum help. So like what Jimmy was just talking about is you're starting with moving someone's body, your hands are on them, and that's going to be the maximum amount of support. That is the most that you can do for them. So you're going to begin with a prompt known to evoke the correct response. So for instance, if pick up cup is the target and I've never picked up the cup, I've never been taught this before, Jimmy will say, pick up cup, and he'll take my hands and pick up the cup. That's the maximum amount of support. And then as the sessions go on, he's going to gradually reduce to a less intrusive prompt. So that could be tactilely tapping my hand to touch it, tapping the cup, tapping my elbow, looking at it. It's just gradually kind of determining what's the maximum amount of help and then fading it backwards, essentially. We recommend using this prompt method when teaching a brand new skill to avoid embedding any errors into that chain. And the next one is on the other side of the spectrum, which is least to most. So you're starting with the minimum amount of help the maximum. So with that same example, the minimum support would just be Jimmy saying, pick up cup. He's not helping me at all. He's just giving me the natural instruction. And that would be this. And then moving up the gradient, so to speak, to evoke the correct response. So then it could be pick up cup. That's not working. Then it could be gesturing to the cup. It could be tapping my elbow. Then it's going to be a full hand over hand. We recommend using this prompt method when you know your learner is resistant to physical touch. That's a very common thing. And if they already have some parts of that task already learned, and we'll talk about what that might look like later on.
Think of like a good analogy for that is thinking of like turning the dial up or down, right? Mm-hmm. Most to least is turning the dial down. Least to most is turning the dial up. Mm-hmm. And again, which method you use is really specific to your comfortability and to your learner. There have been research articles on comparing. What they really have determined is that not one is really superior to the other. It really is individualistic to your particular learner. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to talk about structure prompts and prompting by time. So structure prompts is fading, right? Is fading the physicalness, the structure, if you will, across your prompts. So let me give you some examples. If I was to provide a vocal prompt, which means I say it, you say it, right? Let's say, for example, I'm trying to teach Marissa to answer this question, tell me something that's sweet, and I want her to say candy, right? So that's the ultimate goal. What is something sweet? She says candy, and I'm going like, yeah, candy sweet. Okay. Now the prompt there would be, I say the word candy. Now I can fade that by structure. I can fade it by using a full to partial to even less of a partial. So it might look something like this, full prompt. Hey, Marissa, what is something sweet? Candy.
Candy.
Right, candy. That's a full prompt. A little bit later, I can come back and go, hey, Marissa, what's something sweet?
Candy.
Right, candy. A little bit later, I can come back and go, hey, Marissa, tell me something sweet.
Candy.
Right. Again, a little bit later, tell me something sweet.
Candy.
Right. A little bit later, tell me something sweet.
Candy.
Right. I like to eat candy too. So as you can see, you can take the physicalness, if you will, of the prompt, and you're just kind of shaving it away. How you do that is very specific to your learner. Same kind of idea. What if I was modeling? It was a model prompt. For example, if I'm teaching Marissa to follow simple directions, I would want a teacher say to maybe clap her hands. So when I say clap your hands, she should, and then usually like, hey, great job, way to go. But let's now say that she can't do that skill, but she has the capability to model my behavior. Well, I can use that prompt to teach her to follow that direction. So it might look something like this. Marissa, clap your hands. And then immediately what I'm going to do is I'm going to clap my hands. Why? Because when I clap my hands, Marissa will clap her hands. So I say, good job, way to go. A few trials later, I might say, clap your hands. Good job. Few trials later, clap your hands. Good job. A few trials later, clap your hands. And now notice I'm just bringing up the partial part. Clap your hands. Good. A few trials later, clap your hands. Hey, way to go. So again, I'm just taking away the length and the complexity of the model. If I was using physical prompts, if I was asking her to select things maybe from a table or some objects, I might say to her, hey, can you find the cup? And now it would be great if I could just model it, but if she did not have that skill, I might have to move her through some of these things. So it might look like a full physical. I might say, hey, Marissa, can you find the cup? I now grab her hand and I get her to touch the cup. She touches the cup, I say, way to go, good job. A few trials later, I might say, touch the cup, and now my hand comes, I know you can't really see this, but my hand is kind of coming as close as possible to her hand to see if I can get her to move it. And then what you do across subsequent trials is you're trying to fade out just enough so that the learner is doing it on their own more and more, and you're doing it less and less. I wish we could tell you of a sliding scale. There are some ABA discrete trial programs that will really outline that for you. I sometimes find those can be very by the book, and sometimes people will follow it without being in tune with their learner. So what I would certainly recommend is know your learner, know this, it's kind of like an everyday kind of dance. You're following their lead, they're taking your lead, you're following their lead, you're taking their lead. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is to get in and get out as quickly as possible so that the learner is doing the things you've asked them to do or the things they're supposed to do in specific contexts without any additional help. And that's what we mean by independence. When they're, like Marissa said earlier, when they're prompt dependent, what they're basically saying is, you haven't faded out the prompts successfully for me. And I like that analysis because it puts the onus of responsibility upon the parent, the educator, the therapist, the behavior analyst, then upon the learner. Because once they're the prompt dependent, well, that's your problem, buddy. So there's ways that we can help them with that.
Yeah.
Okay, last one is prompting by time. Mm-hmm. And all this basically means is between your direction and the prompt you provide, you want to insert a time there, okay? I didn't explain that really well, so let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. Let's say we are trying to teach Marissa her name. And now what would be the ultimate goal? I might say, hey, what's your name? She should say,
Marissa.
Marissa, and I say, oh, hi, Marissa. That's that could be a vocal response. If it was someone who was using their AAC talker, it might be that they're selecting the picture of their name. If it was someone who was a signer, it might be that they're finger spelling it. Whatever the modality for your learner is, the same basic procedures will account for that. Okay, so in a time delay, what we're looking for is the time in between the direction and the amount of help. Okay, so let's give you an example. Let's do what we would talk as a 0-second time delay, although I don't think there's something called 0 second. I don't know why we say it. When I'm looking at it now, I'm like, why would we say that? What we really mean is after you provide the direction, immediately prompt the learner. So for example, if we were teaching Marissa her name, it might look something like this. What's your name? Marissa.
Marissa.
Marissa says Marissa, and I go, yeah, great job. Hey, Marissa, nice to meet you. Now, after a few trials, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a time delay in between the pause, in between the prompt. So it might look something like this. I'm going to wait 2 seconds. What's your name? Now, Marissa doesn't respond. So at the 2 seconds, I'm going to say, Marissa.
Marissa.
Right, your name is Marissa. So let me do that again without the explanation. What's your name? Marissa.
Marissa.
Right, Marissa. On future trials, as we move further, I will increase the length of time. So let's say I'm doing it for 5 seconds. It might look like this. What's your name? Marissa.
Marissa.
Right, your name is Marissa. Now, what you're hoping that's going to happen is that in between the count, and again, I'm not holding my hand up, showing the learner. What I'm just doing is I'm visually representing the pause. The idea behind the pause is you're giving the learner an opportunity to respond to the directive or the instruction. So, for example, when I say, "What's your name?" and I'm going, the hope is before I get
Marissa.
to, yeah, your name is Marissa. Perfect. So the idea behind the time delay is to give the learner an opportunity to respond before we help. And a cool strategy with that is you can combine all of these kind of strategies. You can prompt by time and by structure. So for example, let's say I was doing a 5-second delay to teach Marissa her name. It might look something like this. What's your name? Marissa.
Marissa.
She says Marissa. I could do something like this. Now I'm going to fade by time and structure. What's your name?
Marissa.
Right. So again, don't get stuck so much in the procedure. What you really want to be thinking about is what is the question, the direction, the context in which you want the learner to do something, and then in that space in between there. That's all the cool things that you will say or do by either structure or time. That's the beauty of it. In the brief amount of time between me saying, what's your name, and her name, that's where all the cool stuff happens, right? And it really, you can follow a scripted version of it, or you can know your learner and do this kind of dynamic interplay, like, yeah, that one worked, that one didn't work. And you're making these moment-to-moment decisions to get to the learner where they ultimately need to be. For some learners, you can move fast. For other learners, you might have to be a little bit more meticulous and slow and conservative in your procedures. Okay, so let's finish up what we mean by wait time, which I've kind of already discussed by time delay.
Mm-hmm. We're just going to highlight this quickly. And if I were to give Jimmy a time prompt, I could tap to my watch and he could know that we're running out of time, which we're not, but if we were. Okay, so you probably have heard this phrase being thrown around quite often, especially now that we're doing virtual learning and just in general during parent-teacher conferences as well. So we're going to talk about what is wait time. Jimmy's already done a great job at highlighting that. But wait time is the amount of time that elapses when the instruction, directive, or question is asked from when the response is given by the learner. More specifically, it is the time determined by parent, teacher, therapist that allows the learner to respond on their own before providing help or feedback. Wait time is what we do, what the adults do, what the teachers do, not what the learners do. Learners are not counting in their head for how long they should wait to respond to you. So why is it important? It allows our learners time to process the questions being asked, think about the answer or response, and then respond. It helps to decrease that icky prompt dependency word, and it helps to increase independent responding. And there are 3 things that can happen after a direction or question is given. This should be pretty obvious, but we're going to highlight it anyway. Your child might answer independently, might do the task correctly, or will engage in activity independently. That's great, but that's not, everything's not always perfect like that. They then might just answer incorrectly, which is okay. Or the learner just might not answer at all, which we would consider like a no response. So Jimmy, if you want to talk through quickly what we do in each kind of scenario.
Sure. Okay. So I'm doing incorrectly and
yes.
No
So
response.
yes.
So I needed that prompt. Thank you very much. See what we're doing there? Okay, so if your learner, and again, these procedures are basically the same for both, whether incorrect or incorrectly. So I'm just going to sum it up.
Mhm.
What we would say is if your learner responds incorrectly or doesn't respond at all within the time frame, what we would say is repeat the directive or repeat the question again, only because there's been too much time in between what is said and what is supposed to happen. So we would say is repeat the instruction again. Immediately we would say is go right back into prompting the correct response in a way that is the least intrusive to your learner. Immediately then, right after that, provide some verbal praise, some reinforcement to build that kind of the strength of that unit. If you have tokens there, provide a token, all the bells and whistles at that particular moment. But then what we want you to do is to think what was necessary at that given moment and how in the future or future time opportunities, how I can fade that. Here's where working in collaboration with your speech language pathologist, your OTs and your PTs and your teachers and all the educational team is to have that kind of discussion. I know sometimes in some of these Zoom meetings, we're trying to encourage you to wait. We're trying to encourage you of what we think might be the best prompt level versus what you think might be the prompt level. But I think having an open discussion with your therapeutic team about what just might be the optimal one is a good discussion to have overall, and typically in the beginning of your session and maybe at the end to see, where you left off and what you might like to do the next session. Because I want you to remember this, where you leave off a session does not necessarily mean where it's going to pick up.
Mhm.
So for example, if I was had a session with Marissa and I'm getting her to answer to her name, and I end the session with Marissa being independent. So I gave her a full vocal prompt, a partial prompt. I was able to delay it by time. And at the end of the session, when I said, hey, what's your name? She says, Marissa. Now the next day, I ask her the same thing again, and she's not as independent. What I don't want to do is say, come on, Marissa, you knew this yesterday. You should know this. I don't understand what's going on with you. What I want to do is default back to a particular stage where she's successful. Because what we don't want to do is frustrate the learner for a few reasons. One, it will evoke or bring out a lot of challenging behavior. It changes the nature of the session from a positive to a negative one. And from your own perspective, it creates a lot of frustration and anxiety. So think of this whole prompting and prompt fading and structures and all that stuff we had talked about, wait time, as this dynamic interplay, this dynamic dance. You're going in and out. Why? Because we're trying to make our learners as independent and successful as possible. So let me finish up with a few tips and then we'll call it a day. So now what I have to do is go through the text to find a prompt necessary for me to engage in this talking type of behavior. Do you see how it all comes together? Okay, so here's some tips we say. Try to determine what the learner will do during specific situations or contexts. That is, what's the ultimate goal? If it's hand washing, if it's answering a question, if it's doing a physical activity, what should this look like when your learner is independent, is doing it on their own? Have that discussion with your therapist, your teachers, etc. Determine what prompts are necessary in order to do it. Where might your learner need that help? Are they more of a physical? Are they more of a vocal? Do they need a full prompt? Do they need a partial prompt? Do they need it by time? Where should I start to introduce the prompt by time and other things? When you are in these sessions, determine how you can help them less the next time they do it. So you always want to be thinking about, after your learner responds, okay, what was it that got them to do it? I saw that Marissa had asked my child to say, what's today's date? And my child didn't respond until I said, like, oh, okay. So I had to kind of give them a slight vocal prompt to get it going. On the next time, maybe I'm going to fade that by structure. I might just go, or I might kind of wait it out a little bit. And that's the kind of discussion that you will have had with your teachers or your therapists or your OTs, so that you guys are in unison with those kind of procedures. Remember, always make it a positive experience for your learner. What we don't want to do, like I mentioned before, saying, well, come on, you already knew this, And now we're putting the learner in a really precarious situation, and we're putting the onus of responsibility on them. And it's really not. The onus of responsibility is on us, how we help and how we get rid of those across structure and time. And try to be cognizant of when you're close to reaching that particular goal. Remember, it might not happen in one session, and that's okay. That's what life is. Life is these small systematic steps where we're helping and we're not helping. So try to be as cognizant as possible. I'm checking my prompt now, and it's time for me to go. I hope you enjoyed this particular newsletter. Please reach out to us. Please provide feedback. You can email us, you can call us, and we hope you really enjoyed this particular newsletter. I'm Jimmy O'Brien.
And I'm Marissa Eck.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.